Elsewhere, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is angered by U.S. President Barack Obama's criticism of press freedoms in Turkey. Erdogan says he felt offended by Obama's comments. On Friday, Obama said that the approach Turkish authorities have been taking towards the press could lead to the country down a troubling path. Erdogan insists that there's enough press freedom in Turkey, arguing that even the publications which insult him are not shut down, whereas there have been reports of thousands of people prosecuted in Turkey for insulting top authorities. Two senior journalists from the opposition, Cumhuriyet Daily, also faced trial for revealing Ankara's military support for anti-Syrian militants. Political analyst Gearóid Ó Colmáin joins us now from the French capital, Paris. Sir, welcome to the program. What are your thoughts on U.S. President Barack Obama's criticism of press freedom in Turkey and of the response that he has received from the Turkish president?
I think the first thing to say about the U.S. government's attitude to press freedom is that it is extremely selective. If you look at the regimes the U.S. government supports, there is virtually no press freedom in those regimes. Take, for example, Colombia in Latin America, where journalists and activists and union leaders and anybody who speaks out about government corruption is routinely assassinated by paramilitaries linked to the government. That government in Colombia has the full support of the United States, and you could say that of many other Latin American countries, and going back over the last century. The U.S. had no problem with Turkey when Turkey was cooperating with U.S. strategic objectives in Syria. I think the strategic objectives of the United States have changed somewhat since the beginning of the war 5 years ago. The U.S. is now intending to get control of the Kurdish movement in Syria. They have made statements about federalization, in favor of federalization, which is the U.S. plan in Syria. And so I think the U.S. government is in conflict with Turkey on this issue. Another point that needs to be made here, of course, is that it is now out in the open that Turkey is backing the Islamic State. We have confirmation documents provided by the Russian government to the United States, or to the United Nations, have confirmed what we have been saying for the last 5 years, that Turkey has been backing the Islamic State in Syria. So I think the United States is trying to distance itself slightly from Turkey. We saw that again in 2014 when the Vice President of the United States, Bill Biden, told a group of students in Harvard University that Turkey was backing Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Syria, and the U.S. government was trying to distance itself from that. So now that it's obvious, and now that everybody knows that the Turks are backing the Islamic State, I think the United States is trying to cover up its role in this genocide against the Syrian people by distancing itself from Turkey. But of course, there are geopolitical aspects as well, which I've just mentioned. For example, the attempt by the United States to get control of the Kurdish movement in Syria, and that there is serious conflict between Turkey and the United States about how the Kurdish issue is managed. So I think that those factors are important to point out. There is very little press freedom in the United States itself for investigative journalists. A lot of top journalists have died in mysterious circumstances. We could talk about Michael Hastings in 2013, who died mysteriously. And there are many other cases. So the United States has no intention of supporting press freedom anywhere. So when they talk about press freedom, it really is a sort of a message to Ankara to say that, look, you've got to cooperate with us, or else we'll reveal to the world what you're doing. But I think this is part of the U.S. Right now, this criticism of press freedom in Turkey. Of course, there's atrocious things going on in Turkey, particularly against journalists. But this campaign by the United States is really part of the continuation of dirty politics, of cynical use of human rights issues and so on, to put pressure on Ankara.
Well, focusing back on Ankara, in opposition to the comments made by U.S. President Barack Obama, Erdogan stated that he's insisting, rather, that there's enough press freedom in Turkey. As you mentioned, that statement is rather inconsistent with realities that are taking place for journalists there. There were reports of thousands of people prosecuted in Turkey for insulting authorities. And let's not forget the two senior journalists from the opposition Gearóid Daily, who also, they were facing trial for revealing Ankara's military support for anti-Syria militants, including the Daesh Takfiri terrorists.
Absolutely. I mean, it's no longer a secret. It's been admitted by pretty much everyone, by the Western press, by the United States government, by the Russian government, that Turkey is backing the Islamic State. They're providing guns and ammunition and support and all kinds of logistical support to Daesh Takfiri across the border into Syria. And anyone who reveals that, anyone who did reveal it, was anyone who has revealed it, rather, has been prosecuted in Turkey. And yes, of course, we're talking about a regime that's authoritarian and that is, I think, now out of its depth, because it's got into such a mess in Syria, and it now realizes that it no longer perhaps has the support of the United States. And so it's sort of Turkey has lost all of its friends in the region since 2011. And now they're in trouble with the Russians. They're in chaos in Syria. They're losing in Syria because the Islamic State are now being destroyed by the Russians. And of course, the Americans are now turning on them. So it's a very precarious future, I think, for Turkey.
Thank you, sir. Political analyst Gearóid Ó Colmáin joining us from Paris.